Good evening, everybody. I am joined today by Aydin Paladin, and we are going to be having a little chat about the glorious thing that is RK selection theory, as long as a little bit of, or as well, I should say, as a little bit of the life history, and then some of the various psychological adaptations which have come along with that, and also just looking at the social-psychological side of things. So, hello, Aydin. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Aydin. God damn it, I had to condition myself for ages to say Aydin. It's A and Y to me. I just look at it and it's I. It's I
That's
to
fine.
me.
Yeah.
Okay, well, okay,
Okay.
great. In the name of professionalism, we've screwed everything up in the first 30 seconds. Great.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so we can never have anything work perfectly. Never. Okay, so we've both got a little bit of little sort of write-ups and some notes to go through on this topic, and we're going to be addressing, well, I think, just kind of the topic from multiple fronts. We've got kind of the socio-biological angle, which I'm going to be hammering in, and then we're going to let your expertise for the socio-psychological, I'm getting so tongue-tied on that, socio-psychological side to take over there. And I think we're going to try and address a lot of misconceptions that some people might have just around the theory and about how it's all applied.
Yeah.
So I think one of the sort of questions before we go into this is what sort of has really prompted you to take this interest in it? Because I know this has been kind of a recent thing that you've been delving into.
I just had a question. I was wondering why I kept seeing all of these news articles, which is, I mean, this is typical scientific investigation, I guess. I saw something, I observed something, and I wanted to figure out why I was seeing all of these seemingly like upper middle class women from Europe going off to Syria and marrying jihadis. And so I started looking into the possibility that this had something to do with mates. Well, looking into questions about mate selection. And so that leads you very quickly to RK. And moreover, the part that I always find interesting and what I would be looking for there is something to do with personality. For me, I would be looking at personality differences and differences in psychology. I mean, of course you have to understand the basic biological model first. But and as I've gone through it, I've learned more and more about it. It's really interesting how this has been applied to psychology. And it's actually one of the really hot topics in evolutionary social psych right now. It's on the genetic role, or the role that genetics have on our individual personalities, because we would typically like to think of ourselves as independent of our genes, but it looks like a lot of the way we behave in terms of who we are as people has a lot to do with biology.
All right, sounds pretty good then. So let's. I think we should launch straight on into all of this now and give people all of that academic-tism that they've been waiting so very long for. All right, so I've got myself my little write-up here, which I'm just gonna slog my way through. It's not too long, but if you do want to contribute anything, feel free to just tell me to STFU and interject whatever it is that you've got to add, because I know that you've got some extra information on the socio-biological side as well.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, good stuff. So, to begin with, I think it's kind of important to understand the connection between biology, breeding, mate selection, and the psychological adaptations that these things have given rise to, owing to the fact that they are completely inseparable things. They all operate together at the time, and it's all interacting constantly in a big feedback loop, basically with the environment. You can't separate any one of these factors out from anything. And so I want to sort of give a little hypothetical demonstration with a few imaginary animals, although you can quite easily find real life examples of this. So we'll say we've got a couple of pairs of primates, and we'll say that from species 1, we'll pretend that species 1 has 2 monkeys of basically, and we've got a pair of skulls, so we'll go with that. And we'll say that they've got two totally different skull shapes. You know, one of them is quite small, quite demure, fairly average teeth, small brow. It's more like a human than an ape, but just scaled down. And the other one is a lot larger, has long, pointed canine teeth, strong brow ridge, and a much heavier jaw and all of that stuff. And if in that example we said that the first was female, and the second, the larger one, was male, so then we've got another species, species 2, and we'll say that these two skulls are more or less indistinguishable from each other. There's so little difference as that it's basically not worth commenting on. So the question is then, what do we instantly know about these species? Well, the first species, which is our sexually dimorphic species, we know that they're going to have a social structure which benefits from the sexual dimorphism that those animals display. So most likely it would indicate large, stronger males protecting females. It would imply a breeding model with some degree of tournament, probably aggressive, and it may indicate either a single male with a harem or a small group of hierarchical males with many females. And overall, in that paradigm, you'd expect there to be quite a lot of male aggression. So in the second species, which has little to no sexual dimorphism, you would expect a lot less aggression, because they're not a species that's built for confrontation, necessarily. So you would expect, in that instance, to find just generally a lot less aggression. So when you look at other factors, such as breeding variability, that is, the number of offspring sired by the males, the first species, the tournament species with two very different sizes, you would expect quite a small number, maybe around 10% or less of the males to actually reproduce because of the fierce competitive nature. And that nature is something which is being selected for by the females, and it's perpetuated by the male success. So the dimorphic traits are the things which are being selected for. And in the second, the more balanced species, you'd expect a more equal outcome of variability. Most of the members would pass on their genes because these extreme differences in fitness, well, they don't really exist, and it's because they're not really required. So adding on to that previous point is the idea of female choice, which we've kind of mentioned a little bit there. So between the two species, species 1, you'd expect females to be selecting for the dimorphic traits on display, because those adaptations are going to give the female's offspring the best chance of survival, since the father may actually, in those cases, be nothing more than a sperm donor. He may display very little parental investment. In the second species, which is the ones of equal size, you'd expect female choice to be a bit more careful, a bit more strategic, owing to the fact owing to the next factor to consider, which would then be the parental care. Those females would then be looking for males who would be generally more interested in actually taking an interest in the young and caring for them. Now, it gets a little bit fuzzy because you can find high and low parental care in situations that resemble both of the species, but again, this is a pretty generalized guideline. So you'd expect there to be higher parental care and investment, especially male care and investment, in the second species, and less so, perhaps even none, from the first species. So we could go on and on with lists of traits and differences that we can predict based purely on the biology of these animals. But frankly, I think the point has been made. You can't separate the biology from the behavior of an animal. The biology informs a lot of the behavior, and then the behavior informs the biology. It's this big feedback loop. And then obviously all of that stuff is set in an environment which feeds information into all of those other things, and it's all one big circular
clusterfuck.
Yeah, basically. It is just a clusterfuck of variables all influencing each other constantly. So, biology is an influential factor in how a species will function, and also how it will behave. And that last point is important because behavior also includes psychological adaptations. And basically, the brain of an animal is molded to how its body works, and the behaviors that it will need to survive. But, and I'm going to make this abundantly clear here, because I know people are going to say it, we're not saying that that is to the point of absolute determinism, because brains do have degrees of plasticity, varying by species, but that allows animals to adapt their behavior to environmental changes and various environmental cues. So, again, it's not an absolute, but it's a general indicator. And thus, then you have that eternal feedback loop of biology, environment, and it just goes on and on and on, and has shaped all life on the Earth as we know it. Now, we're going to get on to the RK thing here. So, RK, it's a model which describes breeding strategies from low parental investment, higher numbers of offspring with just general lesser investment, that's the R strategy, and then fewer offspring with higher investment, which is generally the K strategy. Now, we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. We'll go into a few more of the in-depth bits. But that's basically the difference. It's the difference between fire and forget offspring, just have loads of them, leave them to their own devices, and hope some of them grow up one day, maybe, perhaps. Or the long time bun in the oven, nurture them, protect them, play with them, help them grow. They're both strategies, and they both work. But obviously different species have chosen different routes because it works not only for them from a biological standpoint, but also from an environmental standpoint. And obviously that's the feedback loop coming back in, which has determined which of these routes they're going to go more down. And that's another key point here. So all RK theory is an acknowledgement that different species have different reproductive strategies, and that those strategies lie on a continuum from more R to more K. That's it. R and K are not discrete categories. It's not, and never has been, this species is R selected, this species is K selected. It's the continuum between the two, with species manifesting as closer to one or closer to the other. And also, RK doesn't prescribe the methods of reproduction at all. It doesn't, because you can find any manner of species that are more R-type and more K-type. So you can find varying strategies at varying points. So even if you're quite far on the K end, it doesn't necessarily dictate that, oh, it's going to be a mammalian pregnancy or something like that. No, you can have more K-selected things that do the whole egg laying and all of that stuff. So it's not species dependent or anything like that. All right, going ever onwards here. Just gonna have a quick bit of water. All right, so R selection. And do feel free to chip in if you think there's anything which needs to be added onto these lists.
Sure.
All right. Like I said, I don't want you to feel like this first half is going to be you sitting in silence, and then you get your say.
Not at all. I mean, you're saying what I would say, so
that's brilliant. Then makes life so much easier. You get someone else to do the talking for you. You just sit back and relax and claim all the kudos. I'm totally going to be doing that in the second half of this stream. Yeah, I was going to say all of this. Yeah, honest. So no, I invited the social psychologists on here to say things that it's totally not that I have gaps in my knowledge on the subject, honestly. Alright, so we've got R selection, which is generally defined by unstable environments. It's density independent, and that is unstable environs prevent the species from reaching the carrying or the K capacity. Small size, generally, many offspring, earlier maturation of those offspring, shorter life, and usually a lot of them will die early on, and very few of them will reproduce, generally. Then we've got K selected. That's K as in the carrying capacity. We've looked at R, which is rate, as in high rate of reproduction. Now we're on to K, which is the carrying capacity. That's generally found in stable environments. It's density-dependent interactions, that is, it'll manifest in cases of stability, largely unaffected by sudden changes that would threaten the populace, so they need a degree of stability to survive that. They tend to have larger size, fewer offspring, later maturation of those offspring, longer lived, and fewer of them will die earlier, and most of them will reproduce at some point. So, when applied to humans, we are not talking about some absurdist idea that some humans are R-selected fish people laying thousands of eggs, while all the others are K-type single children having long pregnancy nurturing sorts of people. It doesn't work like that. So, in reality, what we're referring to is more R and more K selected humans. So, how do you measure this? Well, a really, really
Oh,
simple
I do want to
Oh, yes, please do.
point that out real quick, just as a quick aside, because there is this misconception that's been going around that an individual species within species cannot be more R or K selected, and that's false. Did you want to wait to cover this, or did you want me to give my? Or I didn't know if you had gotten to that. That there can be
I can
species.
bang through my single
No, go
example
ahead,
here,
and
then by all means go on about
I
the
just have
species.
a couple left.
Yeah. It may very well make my next couple of paragraphs redundant, which would be great.
Well, oh no. Well, okay. Or wait. I just want to make sure I'm not jumping the gun.
No, it's fine. This is why you're here, to add your expertise to this topic as well. So when we're referring to more R or more K selected in humans, a really simple example of this is you have two sets of parents. One set of parents has one child. The other set of parents has two children. The set which has had two children is more R selected than the parents who had one child. That's a really just simple way of looking at it. They're both still a K selected species, but one has leaned a little bit more towards the R because they're leaning more towards the higher rate than the people with one who would be leaning more towards carry, because obviously if you've got one child, you're generally able to invest more in it than someone who has two. Not universal, but generally.
Yeah. My only point was that this does not occur only in humans. This occurs across many different species. Dandelions, that's Gagdill and Solberg, 1972. Field mice, Craig's et al., 1973. American shad, Leggett and Carsadon, 1978. Flies and milkweed bugs, Taylor and Condor, 1980. The fact of the matter is that this is, as you have said, that as it is not clearly delineated that a species is R or is K, and it's a continuum, individuals within the species can always have differences.
Yes.
They can be more individually RK, as you just said. So yes. Humans are not alone in this. This is common across nature.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's one of those things because in some cases, considering things like subspeciation can be labeled by reproduction, it's one of the criteria by which you can delineate between subspecies. You will find that in some cases subspecies are delineated purely on something that is different in reproduction. There'll often be something else, but it can be one of the major criteria. So in that instance, it is one species reproducing in two different ways, which then warrants saying, that's that one, that's that one. They're the same but different. Which is, again, all subspeciation is. Again, some people seem to not understand that. They can be quite arbitrary in some cases. So we've got a few examples here of some things which seem like they mess up RK theory, but they don't. So things like certain species of trees, for instance, which are very long-lived. You can get some species which, hundreds, thousands of years old, which is a distinctly K trait. They tend to be quite large, especially if they live that long. Again, K trait. But then every year they produce thousands and thousands of seeds, which are its offspring, which is an R trait. So you can get animals which exhibit patterns from both quite extreme ends of this thing, which then means they end up falling somewhere in the middle just by virtue of how far on either side some of those traits are. Again, this is not something which disproves RK theory, it's not something which renders it useless, it just demonstrates that RK theory has limitations, which pretty much every single theory in any sort of science has. You will never find something that explains literally everything absolutely perfectly, especially when it's a first time round, which RK kind of is. You will then get extra iterations on top of that and other ideas and other theories which build on top of what this has already found in order to make it more accurate, which is exactly what happened with RK.
Yep.
Right, so there are other models which can be used, such as the life history theory, and that is a model which accounts for all of the other variables that RK is kind of less able to deal with. So that one, life history theory, will deal with things like organism size, age of maturation, number of offspring, lifespan of whatever you're dealing with. There's many traits that it'll do, and it does all of that in an attempt to predict the importance of each one of those roles, the importance of each one of those strategies will have across sort of multiple different strategies like that. So it kind of gives you a bit more of an accurate way of looking at things. You're not just sort of looking across one dimension, you're looking across multiple dimensions on that one. Okay.
Sure. Another thing about the life history theory is just a little bit to describe. So the things you mentioned also includes predation. It's a fuller model, and sometimes when people will talk about RK, they don't realize that it's not so much been subsumed into the life history theory, but the life history theory is just fuller. And I do want to point out really quickly what life history and as an extension RK is, which is an allocation of the biological material resources as a process of evolution into certain factors. These factors are somatic, that is self-preservation. So it's not just reproduction. It's a somatic allocation or somatic effort. So providing for the self, making sure that you don't die. A reproductive effort, which is support of the production of offspring, as we've been talking about primarily. There's also a mating effort, which is the amount of, again, resources and materials put into finding a sexual partner. But be aware it is distinct from mating effort. And then finally, nepotistic effort, which comes in terms of helping or assisting our kin or relatives within a tribal society. And that describes this that life history model, and those different types of effort are applied to across the natural order, all living things.
Yep, exactly right. It's just a more comprehensive model than RK. It doesn't disprove RK, it doesn't invalidate RK, it's something which is built on the foundation of RK. It's kind of, as I said earlier, it's just a newer theory that updates RK and gives it all of the previous information that RK didn't take into account, because it was kind of the first run through of that model. It's a more refined thing, but it doesn't displace it, doesn't subsume it, doesn't destroy it, doesn't prove it's wrong. It's just there as another, and some would say more accurate way of dealing with it.
Yep.
That's all it is. So now we get to move on to the psychological development. Oh yay, fun. And this, when it comes to humans, we're going to have to talk about the pattern of human mate preference. And that is one which is known as hypergamy. And I know that word triggers some people so goddamn hard. And I don't know why. It is a word that in its simplest term talks about the tendency of the human female to marry up. So in other words, to select a mate of equal to or higher social status than themselves. So Bus89 conducted a cross-cultural research on 37 distinct and different cultures, drawn from 33 countries located on 6 continents and 5 islands from all around the world, and found a universal pattern in human mate preference, which indicated that females were found to value cues of resource acquisition in potential mates more highly than males did. Meanwhile, males valued signaling of reproductive capacity, which is basically signs of fertility, more so than females did. And notice on both of those, it is more so than. It's not that one prefers exclusively that thing and the other prefers exclusively the other. Again, it's all humans exhibit these behaviors, it's just that some exhibit more of a certain thing than the other does. So again, I'm trying to shut down the potential straw men before they come, because I know that there is always so very many of them. And several studies since then have replicated that finding, because it is just a human universal pattern. So relevant to RK selection theory, and I know you've got a few words for this one, and God, I can't pronounce this name at all. Figueredo?
Figueredo.
That word.
That's how I think it's pronounced.
Okay, I'm gonna go with that. I'm not gonna try and repeat it, but that word, because I am terrible. I am just awful at pronouncing things sometimes. So that was a 2004 studied the heritability of life history strategy, which was the K factor, co-vitality, and personality in a range of both monozygotic and dizygotic twins. And they found that there was a single order factor that explained the preponderance of genetic correlations among the scales used, and that this higher order factor was itself 68% heritable and accounted for 82% of the genetic variance among the lower 3 order factors that the study had found, which kind of indicates that human lifestyle, human strategy towards this is somewhat heritable.
It's actually largely heritable.
Yes.
With that kind of model fit, that's a big one. Moreover, I do want to explain what what now I can't the covitality is that basically what they wanted to see is that if they accounted for this K factor, which they had already actually, here's a problem with these studies, right? They were submitted for publication at the same time. So the study that actually established the existence of the K factor in personality, which I'll go over more when I get into the social psych bit of it. That one actually is dated 2005, and this one's dated 2004. But this study was the heritability study was a response to the earlier one, so it's a little bit temporally out of order.
Hooray for journal study times and review times! Yay, fun!
Right. It just makes it a little bit confusing when you're talking about these two studies. But this one, yes, this one was looking at twins, and the interesting thing was, first of all, it had, as they looked at in personality factors, accounted for, here I have, was 72% of the variance in the phenotypic differences in individuals. And then, yes, it was, the overall model was 61%. However, what they came up with was this, what they called the super K. And the super K factor includes the covitality and the personality factors, all as into a big clump, since they were all heavily associated with each other. Sorry about I'm going to have to deal with the traffic here. Covitality is essentially taking care of oneself, taking care of one's health, and not having negative psychological issues. And then, of course, personality is the big five, is how they measured it. And as you would find with this K factor, and it's what I'll get into, it's really describing what the K factor is. Again, this comes up first because it technically looks like the first study, and more interestingly, this proves that there is, without question, a heritable factor because it looked across twins. So this is not by accident that this thing occurs. We find this trait, this K factor.
Yeah, it's kind of the exact way that IQ was also determined to have a genetic component. It's you take monozygotic twins, genetically identical dizygotic twins, you put them in the same sorts of things, you put them in different sorts of things. If there's still a lot of overlap, well, that kind of indicates genetics.
Yep.
Some people don't like that for some reason, but it's there, you can't argue with it.
Well, there's not really a much better way to isolate it because, as you mentioned earlier, there are a lot of factors involved. In terms of, it's the clusterfuck of, was it something you directly inherited from your parents? Was it a product of your environment? And these are all things that also affect these. But if we look at twins and we find a consistent correlation between traits, well, then there's a good chance that there's a genetic component to it. All
right, good stuff. Now we're going to talk about Rushton. Oh yes, this guy. He also triggers all of the people. He is someone who is frequently just shouted down with accusations of racism, which I find to be just the worst way of dealing with it, because as it works with any sort of social justice thing that you deal with, it's, you're a racist. Okay, that's great. Are you going to address my data? And that part never actually comes.
No, that takes time, man.
Yeah, I know. Some people ain't got time for that. They got Eben Maymays to post on Twitter, yo. It's far more important. Okay, so he's been accused of all of the racism as a result of his works, both the 88 paper and the 96 paper. We're gonna, I think, largely be dealing with the 88, but also the 96. They're both pretty good. So, and in those, he's identified that there were differences between racial groups in relation to RK theory, finding that Asians displayed higher levels of intelligence, they matured slower than European whites, and that blacks were faster to mature, but also exhibited lower intelligences. And it should be noted that these are measured by generality, and are actually then backed up by modern IQ measurements across averages across genetic populations by the use of bell curves. So, of course, this doesn't speak to a strict order of Asian, European, black, not at all. There's a lot of overlap between those bell curves, but it does point out that the means do fall in different places. So that part of it is kind of backed up by later research. So Rushton also proposed the existence, and here we go, of the differential K theory, or the K factor in humans. K factor was kind of the sort of stepping stone between RK to life history. In fact, I believe he also referred to the K factor as life history traits.
When you read his later work, work that he co-authors on, so you don't know who really wrote it. I see him use them interchangeably.
All right, so yeah, good enough for me. Someone's found it happening. Great. So, K-factor, this one is controversial and is still being researched to this day, so I'm just going to quickly blitz through, was it 4 studies? Yeah, 4 studies, and you're going to notice that they do find conflicting information, because this idea that, like, RK and K-factors and things like this, that they're, you know, sort of already set in stone, yada yada yada, no, not true. So, we've got the example here, Miller, 1995, who suggests that environmental variability explains variability in human breeding strategies better than a specific K-factor. There was another study done, Templar 2008, which examined predictions from Rushton's K-factor theory that diverse traits co-vary with intelligence, reproductive strategies, speed of maturation, parental care, and longevity. He measured those against 129 cross-national differences in IQ, birth rate, infant mortality, HIV/AIDS, life expectancy, and found that a K superfactor accounted for 75% of the variance, and that correlations were significantly higher with ethnicity, as measured by skin color as a biological variable, than by GDP, which was a cultural variable. Then there was another study by Dunkel, 2012, which examined self-reported differences in life history between blacks and whites, and found very mixed results with quite small effect sizes, concluding that less than 2% of the variability between blacks and whites was explained by ethnicity. And then there was another study, this is the 4th one, by Dutton, 2016, which looked at differences in androgen levels. So that was one of the tests of differential K theory as well. And he measured, and they were measuring national level indicators of androgen. So that was CAG repeats on the AR gene, and androgenic hair, prostate cancer incidences, sexual frequency, number of sexual partners, and all of this showed that East Asians showed signs of the lowest androgen level for most indicators, but were consistently lower than whites, while sub-Saharan Africans showed inconsistent results, so both higher and lower in various categories compared to other ethnic groups. And this study provided then partial evidence in favour of the differential K theory. So there's a lot of different data around the K factor, some is for, some is against, but to take the concept at face value and either confirm or deny, I think is incorrect. You could cherry-pick data to prove or disprove it at this point in time, because it is still being looked at from numerous different angles. Anything you want to throw on in there?
Well, only the little bit that I have found that might have something to do with genes. I know a lot of people, even if we can say, well, we can show that in a model fit, this is definitely related to genetics. And I've got more stuff on potential relation to genetics as well, but I do have a little bit here. This is from Ellis et al. 2009. I'll give you the citation. This is just a little bit that points to a couple of genes that maybe actually help to explain not only where this K factor comes from, but also why we would see differences in different individuals and even in different groups and people potentially. However, both of the genes that they mentioned here, did you mention the 7R allele?
Yes, this is the CAG repeats from the AR gene, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's, oh no, 7R. Okay. I'm going to read a little bit, if you don't mind, from this, because this is just interesting. And I know almost nothing about actually the genetics. So this is again Ellis 2009. But this is just a little bit that I know people always want to say, point to the gene that is responsible for this behavior, which is an absurdist statement.
Yes,
but,
genes love to be pleiotropic when it comes to behaviors. There is so rarely a single gene.
Let me give his, and this is going to be from him, so all the citations are as cited in variation between and within human populations in LH life history strategies has been linked to measure genetic variation. For example, the modal slow, and by that he means that humans in general as a species have slow life history. And that's another thing that you'll see as life history and RK became sort of interchangeable as terms. People who prefer the life history term and scientists who prefer the life history term. And I think there may be a political aspect to that, but I can't say for sure. It's not my field. Slow life history is the same thing as being case selected, essentially. It's all the things that we've described through what case selection is, that would also pretty much be described by slow life history, whereas fast life history is everything that would be described by R selection. Anyway, the model slow human LH strategy may be supported by the common 4R variant of the human dopamine receptor, D4, the DRD4 gene. DRD4 regulates dopamine receptors in the brain, and variants of this gene have been linked to individual differences in such personality traits as extroversion and novelty seeking. Again, linked, not a direct one-to-one correlation. The 4R allele was apparently the most common form of the DRD4 gene throughout human prehistory, under conditions of environmental harshness, and this is the importance of environment, and resource limitation, which are common in pre-agricultural foraging species, societies. Biparental investment in offspring, durable pair bonds, and strong family ties and cooperation, i.e. slower life history strategies, are generally needed to survive and reproduce successfully. Harding and Cochrane 2002 suggest these ancestral conditions help to maintain the 4R allele, which is associated with more risk-averse mating and social behavior. What's interesting, though, is that the 7R allele on the DRD4, which is associated with more impulsive, risk-prone behavior, appears to have been selected over the past 40 to 50,000 years and has a widely variable, non-random global distribution. So there are certain groups that have more of this, are more prone to this based on analysis of the distribution. Chen et al. 1999 argued that the 7R allele promotes migratory behavior, with bearers of 7R more likely to lead populations far from the ancestral lands of origin, because this would be such as South American Indians, Pacific Islanders. So that's just interesting. I'll point to some genes is the point. People want to say, like, point me to a gene. Ellis et al. Had a nice overview of this, and there's actually several pages of it, but there's some genes. On the DRD4, look for the 4R human dopamine receptor and the 7R allele. There, point to some genes.
All right, good stuff. Again, it's just kind of adding on, like, yeah, there are reasons that people behave in certain ways, as if we didn't already know that. But some people really
for some reason you
hammered in.
You have to, yeah.
All of the bases are covered, right? Oh, where did I get to now? There we go. Okay, so gonna go on to a little bit of further research, and then I'm gonna kind of segue us a little bit more into the socio-psychological side, and then you can have absolute free reign. I'm pretty sure everyone's bored of hearing from me by now, so
No way.
There we go. So, further research by Patel et al. 2004, who measured gestation rates across ethnic groups, found variance between ethnic groups, with the median gestation for Black and Asian to be 39 weeks, and the white Europeans to be 40. So when comparing Black and white women adjusted for body mass by BMI, they found that Black women and Asian women had a higher chance of preterm delivery than did white Europeans. And it's important to note here that there are a myriad of reasons why a child may be born earlier than expected, including socio-demographic characteristics, medical complications, previous preterm delivery, smoking, drinking, maternal age. So we can't chalk this all up entirely to ethnicity or genetics on that. Indeed, it would be somewhat incorrect to try, but it's just further evidence that humans, as with all animals, they adapt their behaviors and reproduction strategies to the environment to a certain degree. And this lends credence to the concept of RK in humans, with some being more R and some being more K, or that faster, slower life history. Those findings were actually a build upon a previous study by Papianic et al. In 1999, who also found that length of gestation was shorter in Black populations by 5 days when compared to white populations, averaging to 39 weeks for Blacks and 40 weeks for whites. This study also found that Black gestational age-specific neonatal mortality was lower in Blacks than whites until the 37th week of gestation, but higher thereafter. So putting that in really simple terms, Blacks would seem, from that to be more capable of handling earlier births than whites. Like, if they come out a couple of weeks early, they're less likely to have complications than a white person would be. Again, not hard and fast, general indication. So that then also fits in line with observations of things like RK theory and life history as well, and rates of maturity and potential numbers of offspring. It's important to note again that when we talk about RK in humans, we're not talking about changing reproductive methods, so that we have the freaky fish people with their thousands of eggs. No, you're all the same species, you're all K-selected by nature of biology. However, these traits that we've seen suggest some people are more inclined to be more R, and others are inclined to be more K. After all, if one person has 2 children, each pregnancy lasting 39 weeks, and another has 2 children, each pregnancy lasting 40 weeks, one of those fits closer on the scale towards R, and the other fits closer towards K. These are very small differences. Very small, but they are still differences, and they will have to be explained somehow. As we've said, there are environmental cues which can do it, but there are also genetic cues which can do it as well. So we've got to kind of work out what's what and what's being affected how much by which variable, because that clusterfuck, it's a wonderful thing. So also then consider the age of menarche in humans. There's various studies on this topic, but I'll specifically reference here Kanazawa 2001, which has found that father absence leads to an earlier onset of menses in human females. So this is yet another reproductive response to the environment, and also signals a shift towards the more R end of the RK spectrum. There have also been studies that indicate an earlier onset of puberty in black populations compared to white when it comes to the developments of secondary sex characteristics. So that's kind of the sociobiological side out of the way, really. We've looked at a lot of that. So now it's on to the socio-psychological side, which is your wheelhouse of knowledge.
Well, you mentioned the Figueredo study. We talked about that. I want to bring up technically Figueredo et al. 2005, which is actually the seminal, weirdly, but so even though it's the date will be later. I've had that happen before. But really what he was just trying to determine was, or what are K-selected behaviors in humans, specifically in terms of our social identities, of who are we as people, as groups, how do we behave? Because we can speak very easily about, large patterns of behavior in animal species, but humans are, of course, a little bit more complex, as are, other animals like apes, who have, and almost generally, mostly speaking, animals that have complex societies are K-selected, and that's part of that. So as part of our K-selected species, again, some people don't become fish. These are the things that make up what we would call the social K-factor. Now, this is the heritable thing. So heritability also, there could be environmental factors, and they did account for that, of the potential of environmental factor, in that twins are generally raised in the same household. But so it can mean there's some level in that of shared parental influence. And I think that's actually something to keep in mind here, that the influence of our parents does potentially have an effect. I have some twin studies research on mate selection. So that one would be this twin studies one. William Ravel and Witt, 2013. And then there also is a Rushton study that looked at mate selection in twins. And it finds that, generally speaking, the thing that will make people select a mate is homophily, but being similar to the person that you're choosing as a mate. But part of that does appear to be a little bit involved with parental styles. So it might have something to do with who your parents were, and that's why I'm just saying, like, some of this, it's possible that some of this is affected more on the social level than on the biological level. However, that would be the variance, I would say, not accounted for in the general 61% heritable model. I'd say some of somewhere in that other 39%, that's a lot of our parents. I think, and from what I've seen, that would make sense. But here's exactly what the K factor is. So these are the K factor variables. To be a more K-selected person, or to possess more of the K factor, because much like the theory in general, it is a continuum. There aren't some people who lack it. Everyone has some aspect of this. So the aspects that are positively associated with the K factor are adult romantic partner attachment. That is how close we are to, how much we want to be, or how close we are with our partners as adults. There is attachment to the biological father, positively associated. So you are more likely to have this K factor, you're more likely to be considered to have this K factor if you have a close relationship with your biological father. And there's an exact negative correlation to having any kind of childhood attachment to a non-biological father figure. It's negatively associated with what I described earlier, that mating effort thing, which is having sex not for the purpose of reproduction. It's also negatively associated with risk propensity. That is that, yeah, you're not too worried. People who don't plan things out, who just kind of like, oh, I don't care what happens. I'll just, I'll base everything on my intuition. People who take risks, that is not associated with this K factor. Negatively associated, I should say. K factor is also negatively associated with neuroticism, psychoticism, and approaching significance, but not fully there. Positively associated with extroversion. Oh, I'm sorry. It's also positively associated with adult partner attachment. So I think when some people talk about RK selection in humans, they talk about these kinds of behaviors of being monogamous, now I don't know where the risk-taking comes in. I know where I think I would make the argument is that people who engage in risky sexual behaviors from a evolutionary standpoint, that's what we would consider, right, to be more R-selected. Because if you're playing fast and hard sexually, well, you know, until the invention of oral contraceptives, pretty much that meant you were going to produce more children and more offspring. So typically speaking, we wouldn't see a lot of that. And I think when people talk about it and they use it as a, quote, metaphor, what they really need to be doing is looking at the research that has been done by Figueredo et al. And his colleagues over the last decade and a half or so, that explains actually the kinds of behaviors that are involved in this and all the other factors, like relationship with the mother, religiosity, beliefs in community. But it's not even that simple. There's we find that it's associated with other things. For example, this was an interesting one. So this is going to be, it's going to be Figueredo et al. On many of them. This would be Figueredo, Andrzejczak, Jones, Smith-Castro, Montero. That's 5, that's enough. 2011. And they were interested in, for example, so there might be this idea that, okay, so one thing that we find about the K factor and how it manifests itself in terms of human psychology is that, as I mentioned in Life History Model, the 4 types of material resource, material and biological resource. One of them is the nepotistic effort. So how much are you going to take care of your kin? So there was a belief maybe, or the hypothesis here was, well, people who have these slow life history preponderance, or who are more K-selected, depending on your choice, that they might have a lot of out-group hate, that they would experience negative ethnocentrism. So I love people who are similar to me because they're my kin, and I will hate people who are dissimilar to me. That was not the finding at all. In fact, people who have this K factor tend to be more altruistic, sort of overall. If you're loaded high on the K factor, so you've got to these positive in-group sort of behaviors, or these positive tribalistic, I mean, tribalistic may sound wrong there, but tribalistic in terms of human tribes. It didn't necessarily mean that you hated somebody who was not part of your kin group, which is interesting. So it doesn't mean that even if you have these high K-selected things, there's anything to do with negative outgroup perceptions. And similarly, let's see, this was Figueredo and Rushton, date on this one, 2009. So Rushton comes back here. This is, I think, the one where I saw him use K factor and slow life history versus fast life history about interchangeably. There's been a lot of, and this is interesting because there's this idea of the general factor of personality. I think a lot of people are familiar with the big 5 personality traits, right? Which are, let's see, I always forget one of them, so let me make sure I have it here so I don't forget. The big 5 personality traits. They are the openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So in previous research, and this is Figueredo 2004, they had already identified that this K factor had a pretty distinct relationship with personality factors, in that the K factor is positively associated with openness to experience, to conscientiousness, to extroversion, to agreeableness, and negatively associated with neuroticism. So then there's this new theory that a lot of people in the field of evolutionary social psych are kind of examining, which is the general factor personality. So when we say G factor and talking about intelligence, this would be the GFP factor, talking about personality, in that there is a general type of personality. It's either you have it or you don't. And the general factor personality is described by altruism, agreeableness, being relaxed, being conscientious and sociable, and intellectually open, with high levels of well-being, satisfaction with life, self-esteem, and emotional intelligence. And people who are proponents of this theory, or of this idea that there is a general factor personality, would say that this actually, whether or not you have this, or your level of your scale on it, is really the only thing about personality that matters, and that getting more into the big five is belaboring human personality to be more complex than it really is, whereas people generally, again, they sit higher or lower on this general factor rather than higher or lower levels of individual factors. And this was associated with the K factor. When they put these two things up against each other, they actually couldn't even totally discriminate them, that they might be kind of the same thing. Or evolutionarily speaking, that human societies developed a lot of these in order for us to get along, and that makes sense. I think that's, some of the basic ideas of what I wanted to talk about in terms of the social attributes, but there's a lot of them. There are a lot of social attributes that go into it, and that Figueredo et al. Study, or the one that you brought up on heritability, let me bring that one up. That one goes into a lot of factors. All of the factors that it looked for there that were positively associated with the K factor, then were genetically. It was self-directed planning, flexible, positive reappraisal, primary control persistence, which means like not giving up in the face of adversity, insight into the past, anticipation for the future, seeking advice, self-agency. Health control didn't work. People who were higher on the K factor had higher financial status. They were more likely to be religious. They had more community-oriented beliefs. That was a really high load. That accounted for 99% of the variance on that. Close relationships with people, altruism towards others, and altruism towards one's own kin, which would support the findings of that ethnicity study. Friendship support, family support. These are all like very positive qualities, though, is what I'm saying. So it's these positive social qualities that can all be attributed to what we would call the K factor in how we behave. And again, as we know, it is largely heritable, and it's largely predictive of those behaviors. So this is more than just, it's not just, it's not about if you are lower on the K factor, there's something biologically different about you. It's just
it seems to be more that you may very well possess basically a different psychological profile.
Yeah, pretty much. It's that, yeah, it's your psychological profile pretty much. And I think in this case, I think people want to say this was like adapting our case selection or adapting life history somehow to Evo social psych where it doesn't belong, but that's not correct. This is clearly has a genetic component, without question. So this is not like these are just that your psychological profile, for example, is completely non-dependent on your genetics. It looks like there's a heritable thing, that there's something about our genetics that doesn't predetermine, but has an influence on who we are as people in terms of how we behave, how we look at the world, and really how we're going to interact with others.
Well, it makes complete sense when you consider if you're one of those people who actually thinks that IQ testing and the Big Five personality work, as opposed to those people who seem to think that they're wrong for some reason or don't prove anything. But it makes sense when you consider the fact that, across a few meta-analyses, which, again, you can go watch my stream with Bunny on this, we've got all the sources and shit on there, right. So about half of your personality is heritable, about 50 to 75% of your IQ is heritable, We know that there are links between things like IQ and wealth, or I should say earning ability, because you can luck into wealth while being really stupid. So it's IQ and learning. We know that there's positive correlations between basically IQ and child rearing, which is smarter people tend to just do it better generally. So you're looking at all of these things which are heritable, then impacting basically how you interact with not only your offspring, but other people as well. So as a result of that, it doesn't surprise me in any way at all that we would find things like reproductive strategies differing based on those heritable traits. It seems almost like it would be a common sense connection.
Yeah, I say this a lot, that a lot when it comes to, particularly social psychology, it has what I would call the no shit factor, and that these are things that are idioms in society of, oh, we know that certain people behave this way or certain people behave that way, but I need to see the data, and then I get fascinated because, oh, look, it is accurate, and not only can I say that how much of your personality is affected by genetics, but I can point to specific traits and aspects of personality that are yes, definitely related to your genetics. Like, yeah, whether or not you will, and it was related to some of the health issues. So, you know, some of the positive self-thought of the covitality, of not having some of these neurotic things, and also related to, yeah, literally your personality. Are you, if you're a more neurotic person, then you're not going to have this K factor, or be lower on it. It's just interesting to me, because I think also there is a perception in society that we are all, well, we're all individuals. No, really, realistically, your genes play a huge role in who you are.
See, some people get really, really triggered by that idea. It's like, no, they very heavily influence factors of your behavior. I mean, even just looking at things like addiction, we've found that there are
massive correlation.
Yeah, it was, I believe it was allele 1 and 2, I think. Basically, everyone has like one, but if you get both of them, you're more likely to have an addictive personality. But then you combine it with, I believe it was rates of serotonin in spinal fluid, like when you get a low rate of that in there as well, and it's basically like, boom, you're gonna be an addict to something if your environment allows you to find something addictive. So it's like, well, welcome to genetics influencing your behavior. You can control the environment and get around it, but if you have these certain genes, you will be more inclined towards a certain pattern of behavior.
Sure, and yeah, it is important to also say, yes,
I'd like to, sorry to cut you off there, but I'd like to also quickly point out things like rates of serotonin production, that can be genetic as well. So yeah, just another thing to consider. It can be environmental, but sorry for jumping in there. I just wanted to slam that in as well.
I mean, yeah, it can be environmental. Like, harshness and unpredictability in environment is associated with, even though as humans we are all inherently K-selective, with your environment's very harsh, and particularly when adults are more likely to die young, it's considered, and this is Ellis again, this was interesting, that when the adults die younger, it can help explain because it's outside of the normal human lifespan. Humans typically, actually, we have a very high survival rate of infants for any species, but particularly for mammals, relatively high. The problem is they die after birth, and then we have a very long life cycle, so we live for a very long time. But even though we have all these K-selected factors, if you are existing in an environment where the adults are dying very young and where there's a lot of unpredictability in the environment, even though for every other reason, you might switch to the more, fast life history strategies, just out of necessity. So there is environmental impact, but the genetic one cannot be, I think, on this point on the RK selection, both in terms of general mating behavior, but also more specifically in terms of our personality, can't really be denied to have a genetic component.
Yeah, well, even just going back to, talking about how high risk environments basically change it. Well, we've already brought up things like, father absence causing an earlier onset of menarche. Exactly. It's also been linked to polygyny as well, which basically is a smaller number of breeding adults, which then, well, specifically a small number of breeding males, so they take multiple partners, which also then causes the earlier onset of menarche as well. So it's kind of like, yeah, if there is a harsh environment, and in that particular study it was males specifically being more absent, well, females basically come into heat earlier in order to replenish the population. Right. It's you can try and sort of deny these correlations and links between things, but I thought people would be more okay with that one, because it's like, hey, here's a behavior that's changed by the environment. But then, well, how is it allowed to trigger? Oh, yes.
It's just, if it's anything that, well, it's because of the associations, you know. Obviously, that people
gas chambers burning. You're talking about genes and behavior. It all ends up in gas chambers. No, it really doesn't, guys.
It really doesn't. I'm going to call it science denialism, honestly, at this point, because to me, for people just to say, like, you can't talk about genetics you can talk about genetics about anything else. I love Darwin. I absolutely believe in evolution, except when it applies to humans. And then all of a sudden, natural selection is out of the window, and we can't talk about that because that's naughty and it might hurt somebody's feelings. So,
and even if I do accept it, it definitely stops at the neck. Brains don't evolve. There was a brain Big Bang. You can watch it on RedTube somewhere, and that's when all the human brains were born. And the brain has not changed since that day, according to environmental pressures at all. It's because neuroplasticity doesn't exist somehow. No, it does.
Yeah, environmental pressures, inbreeding of certain groups, outbreeding of certain traits as encouraged by culture, or encouraging of traits according to culture. There's again, it's the clusterfuck where you start to get into the point where it becomes very difficult to pull out what part is attributable to what aspect of natural selection and evolution, human development. But when I start seeing the denialism that evolution is a thing, and it absolutely affects our brains as it affects everybody else, or every other species on the planet, then I think you're being intellectually dishonest.
Agreed. Right, I believe we've actually sort of run the topic dry here. I have no more notes. Do you have any further notes that you wish to add to this?
I don't think so, unless we had... Yeah, you went over some of the criticisms of it. I mean, and the basic thing about RK is, yeah, it's a theory. It is a framework of understanding, and I would say the biggest problem with RK and life history theory is that it doesn't have a really great boundary limit. I think that it could start to... When you include so many, so when you include a ton of things in a model fit, right? So you have like a regression model, and you're throwing all these variables in. So the list for that Figueredo study that determined the heritability, there were like 50 items that they were assessing as being part of the K factor and the heritability. That is a lot of items to put into a model fit and consider to be one factor.
Yeah.
This is so. Here's my bitch about how this potentially isn't. It's not as succinct. Well, if I throw in everything in the kitchen sink into my regression model, yeah, it will explain 97% of the variance. It's possible some of these are discriminate. They have tried to, and they specifically have accounted for things like, do I have the note here on what was accounted for? Ethnicity, when they accounted for the 2005 study, and they found that didn't account for any of the very, very small amounts. And also social desirability, in that some people may be more likely to go for mating effort rather than reproductive effort because they're very attractive, for example. Those didn't appear to matter very much, though. But again, yeah, if you throw everything into the model, well, it's just, this is an evolving theory. I've heard someone criticized me for citing these like reports from Figueredo and those guys from 2007 to 2010 as being old research.
All right.
It's like, hang on, we're working on it.
Yeah, it's like, first of all, it's still working, and second of all, there's... Okay, Isaac Newton is wrong, guys. His research is really outdated. We shouldn't be using that as the basis for anything in physics. Sorry, no, theories and models do not become outdated. They can become supplanted, they can become added on to, but they don't expire. There's no use by date on them.
No, as RK was essentially supplanted by life history, and there, like I said, there could be a little bit of a political thing there. But all of the sources that you cited that were more recent, pretty much, are exactly in line with what Rushton was citing in '88 about the the age of maturation and such like that, and the gestation periods. He was, talking about that in '88, so that hasn't really even changed.
Yeah. The sort of thing, the thing which I find amusing about that is, like, even if Rushton was doing it because he was the most blindingly racist person who really does believe that we have to enslave the niggers and gas the Jews, even if he was walking around his office shouting that at the top of his lungs all day, every day, it doesn't mean that his research was wrong. You can say, oh, he had a terrible bias in his research. Okay, that's fine. But what do you explain about people who come by 30 years later and reproduce it, and people who don't have those biases?
Sure. Exactly. I mean, I've also cited Miller, and he's like the really questionable one because he's an economist and was trying to make commentary on Rushton. I don't think he knows how to do the research. And I said, I think he definitely had a racial bent on this. But it doesn't matter if Rushton did or not. Can you debunk what he said? Can you prove that this is incorrect? No, it hurts my feelings, I guess. So, but moreover, there's the interesting social psychological link, and so we can show that this definitely does it plays multiple roles in human behavior.
Yes,
that would be my case. I mean, it's the extent to which is questionable, but I think that it's it plays a role.
Yes, these things do play roles, and this is the thing. I mean. When I'm citing research from 2016 on this topic, this thing, I mean, life history, as we said, hasn't really supplanted RK, it hasn't proved it wrong, it's just built on it and provided a load more variables and different ways of looking at things, which ultimately is helpful. But when we've got research that sort of conflicts on the topic, some of it from 2012 and 2016, this is a model. It's a theory that is still very much in the oven. We're probably not going to have a conclusion to this anytime soon. I would imagine it's still going to have contradictory evidence from different studies well into, like, the 2030s, 2040s, if it keeps going at this rate anyway. And I would put some of that down to the fact that there are people who do have ideological reasons for doing this. Now, whether it's ideological because they are blinding racists who just want to prove the superiority of the white man, or whether it's because they have an ideology that says literally everything is socially constructed, genetics plays no role, it's all environment, give me a child and I can determine their entire destiny based on what I do with them.
No, I think the adoption research would make you upset, but on that one...
Yes, that one has been... Yeah, that one is just wrong, but even if we've got people from both of those ends of this coming at it with an ideological bent to do that, you're always going to have this contention, because there will always be researchers who are like that, because there are.
Sure.
There are researchers who set out to prove something. Like, they have their conclusion and they set out to prove their conclusion. I've covered this many a time, mostly with feminist research and a study on video games, where it's, yes, you found 7 instances of bad words being said across how many thousand games?
Yeah,
but misogyny is rampant.
600 twins. 600 twins. But hard to get that kind of sample size.
Yeah.
Versus you found 7. I mean, I'm a social scientist. I'm willing to compromise sometimes on sample size, particularly if we're looking at more qualitative data. But come on.
Yeah, there's only so much. There's so much that I can let slip by before it has to be like, really? No more slippery, please.
Yeah. And I think that's all it is. I think what happens, though, with this, real quickly, is it's 2 people shouting over each other, not understanding nor being willing to read the research. They're shouting over each other, talking about different things. I think some people on the alt-right are talking more about the psychological personality stuff. And then the other people who want to deny, and they're not correct on that either, because I don't think what they wanted to say says what it's saying at all. it's just like a form of social collectivism is what I would say overall. It's I mean, yeah, it's case selection and longer carrying of offspring and other factors of all the things that we've belabored at this point. And then there are people who want to deny genetics, that genetics play any role in human development, and thinking that the alt-right is talking about fish people. And it's like you're shouting at each other and you're not talking about where
you're not actually listening to the other side. You're kind of you're talking past each other at the straw man of the other side, I think.
Instead of getting into...
Yeah, and in a lot of cases creating these weird ideas about what the information says when it's like, it doesn't actually say that.
Because where they would get to, if they were listening to each other correctly, is where we got to almost immediately, which is, well, when you get into the heritability, then it becomes the clusterfuck.
Yes.
Because that's where it goes.
Yeah. People don't like clusterfucks. People like things to be clear and easy to explain.
Yep. And that's and you can argue about that. What part of the clusterfuck does race play a role in, and what part does environment? But you're now dealing with, I think, almost the unknowable, because I don't know how you're going to pull that ball of string apart.
Well, no, because to my mind, environment, genetics, and these things, and reproductive strategies, and all of this stuff, it's too intertwined, I think, to put a definite number on it.
Exactly.
I think the best thing we're going to end up with is some sort of a grey number. But maybe we can do sort of what we've done with IQ, and it's kind of like, it's pretty much somewhere between 50 and 70. It's like, it will vary, and even if we were able to control where everyone had literally the same environment, and technically the heritability would be 100% in such a situation, it's impossible. But even if we could do that, I don't think we'd be able to put that much of a good a number on it. I think what we're looking for is... Yeah, we're still talking about averages here. So I think at best, you're gonna only ever be looking at the effect of X is between this and between this, and this is between here and between here. We're sort of looking at ranges rather than this is it, pinpoint, boom, done, no scope.
Unfortunately, people want like a definitive answer, but the thing about my science, in particular social science, it's, if we find like a correlation of 0.3, we're like, oh wow, that's great. And well, that's not great, but that's pretty good. And that science is not so clear cut, particularly when you're looking at something as complicated as the human race, or anything. I mean, you're defining these little individual factors and how every single thing fits into a model. That's not easy, and it's going to be sloppy, and sometimes you're never going to come to a definitive answer. People want definitive answers. To say, well, it's complicated is unsatisfying.
Yeah, I think in some cases they're going to have to just learn to fucking deal with the fact that it's complicated is the answer. Because I think what they're going to find, especially when they start trying to attack the psychological angle of this, is that so many of these supposedly different traits aren't actually that different. That as with how genes work on this thing, that some of these traits are pleiotropic with each other. They influence each other, as it were, so you can't ever sort of 100% separate them out from each other. Like we can build various models and we can look at, well, as we've done with like the big five, but even there, those things overlap with other things as well. So it's a very sloppy way of explaining everything. But yeah, some of these...
I'm sorry, if you want to say you fucking love science, you have to accept that.
Yeah.
That it's not... It is very rarely, here is the answer. In anything, rarely. Sometimes, but rarely is it, here is the definitive answer, there is absolutely no question or ability for anyone to be wrong, or ability for anything to be discovered in the future also is another thing. To say that some things are totally case closed, there's always that possibility. But that takes someone to look at things in a nuanced way.
Yeah.
And that's cognitively taxing.
That is one of my favorite quotes. The science is settled. Ow. God. Oh God, my science bone. It aches. How could you say this? It never will be. Right.
Yeah, that's about that. I think we've belabored it.
Yeah, we've belabored the point, gone over it in numerous ways, and hopefully given some people some interesting things to to talk about and to consider in their own. And as I'm just going to end this, I suppose I'm going to say, look, I'm going to be linking all of my sources below in this video.
I'll send you all mine.
Yeah, okay, great. I massively appreciate that. So all of the sources which we've referenced will be available in the box below this video. And as we've said, when it comes to things like life history, we've got evidence both for and against. So you'll be getting, on some of these topics, two sides of an argument here. So go in your own time, have a look, actually, you know, do that legwork yourself if you're able to do so. Like if you've got an interest in this and a bit of an understanding, go do it, look at it, start reading things, because the more you understand on this, well, the more you're going to realize it is a complete clusterfuck, but you'll be just more informed on the topic in general, and that is always the goal.
Absolutely. That's the only way you're ever going to come to a satisfying conclusion about it, guys, is if you figure it out for yourself, go read it. Here's the really awesome thing. Despite the fact that research gates exist, you can go to Sci-Bio and find every single thing that I'm certainly going to cite. So it's within arm's reach.
Yes, absolutely. There is no wall to academia anymore. There are all manner of ways around it. So you can go and do it yourself. Right. So we have done all of the things. So now all that I'm going to say is thank you. I'm going to get it right. Aydin, there we go.
Yes.
I have to resist every fibre in my being to say Aydin, because I don't know why. So thank you, Aydin, for joining me. It has been an absolute pleasure. And
thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, excellent. And thank you to everyone in the chat for watching. And they've been talking about anime throughout this entire thing. I'm not even surprised.
What else? Come on.
Absolute degeneracy. Anyway, hopefully we will be able to have a chat about something else at some point in the future if an interesting topic arises somewhere. And with all of that, I shall bid both my guest and the chat adieu.
All right.